Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fleur Newman. I'm the Gender Affairs Officer at the UN Climate Change Secretariat. Apologies for a slight delay in starting. We are doing this webinar in this format for the first time, so please give us a little latitude in terms of our IT capability, or my IT capability. I will do my best. Just before we start, and before I hand over to Jennifer to welcome us, I just wanted to make a couple of points about the technical aspects of this, and that for best sound and audio, and to ensure the minimum amount of feedback, if you could use a headset and to keep yourself muted when you are not speaking. There is a chat function at the top of your screen, and that chat function is to send a message to our IT if you have any issues with that. And there's also a question and answer button, and that can be used for question and answers to the panel. I would now ask Jennifer Hannah if she is, you can hear me, Jennifer, and if you could unmute yourself and please introduce us and welcome us to this webinar.
Thank you, Fleur, for that quick introduction, and I would just like to briefly welcome you all to this Gender Webinar 101. It's basically one of the first activities of the Working Group 2 of the PCCD, the Paris Summit and Capacity Building, cross-cutting issues that basically its target to strengthen the work for capacity building and including gender, human rights, and indigenous platform people. This is basically what we want to do for this webinar. It's to give you a broad aspect of view of how gender is included on capacity building and climate change action. So I'm just going to leave it here and say that we are very excited to have this first of the many activities that we're going to have together with the gender team as well. And I would just pass it along to Fleur now and let's start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and I will there we go. So what we thought we would do to introduce you to the Gender 101 webinar is to just give you a very quick overview of gender within the context of the UNFCCC process, and to also explain a little bit about one of the reasons why we are having this webinar with the PCCC. So for those who aren't aware, gender considerations in the UNFCCC process started in 2001 with a decision which related almost exclusively to the representation and participation of women in the UNFCCC process. This was followed 11 years later by another decision on gender balance and setting a gender balance goal for women's participation in the process. But it was also importantly an opportunity to create a standing item, a gender item on the COP agenda. And it was also a request to the Secretariat to start reporting on the gender composition of both national delegations and constituted bodies, and it also includes the decision-making bodies of the Bureau of the COP, the CNC, and now the CMA. 2 years later, there was a 2-year work program on gender agreed in Lima, the Lima Work Program on Gender, which started out with some workshops and a technical paper, and this was an introduction to gender in the context of gender climate policy and action, gender response of climate policy and action. In the Paris Agreement we end up with the first human rights language in a multilateral environmental agreement, which also includes gender equality and the empowerment of women and intergenerational equity. There are also specific references in capacity building article and the article on adaptation, which is reflective of previous decisions. In 2016, in Marrakesh, where we started, the 3-year work program on gender was agreed, and that runs till 2019. One of the requests to the subsidiary body for implementation was the development of a gender action plan, and that was undertaken during the year of 2017 and agreed at COP23. But that's not the whole picture. Between 2001 and 2012, particularly in the Cancun COP, but there were other COPs in between where gender responsive climate policy and action was identified as something that could make climate policy and action not only more fair, but more effective and sustainable. So then we get to the Gender Action Plan, agreed at COP23, and that didn't create new mandates per se. It's about looking at all of those 60 decisions that mention gender, women, or socially responsible policy, and looking for ways in which to group them so that we could assist in implementation of those decisions. The Gender Action Plan has 5 priority areas, one around capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication that seeks to enhance the understanding and expertise of stakeholders on the systematic integration of gender considerations and the application of that understanding and expertise in all the thematic areas under the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and in policies, programs and projects on the ground. And this webinar is an example of the sort of activity that would be included in that priority area. There's gender balance, participation and women's leadership, and that is that the Gender Action Plan seeks to achieve and sustain the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in the UNFCCC process, with a recognition that there is a difference in the representation and participation of women when compared with men in our process. And this can be done through the awareness raising of the existence, importance and benefits of travel funds for female delegates to the UNFCCC, and also another piece of work that we're working with partners on capacity building activities for national gender and climate change focal points. Third piece around coherence. It's coherence across the UNFCCC and within the UN system itself, so that we're looking at the ways in which work on gender equality can be made coherent not only in our process but also looking at areas of mainstreaming across the Sustainable Development Goals and things like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And finally, we get to gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, a very important component under which we will be looking to ensure that tools such as gender analysis and gender budgeting, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the webinar, are used in the development of NDCs and maps, or in the revision and further development and monitoring reporting. And this is a component in which constituted bodies have a role in that the reporting is also in the normal reports of the constituted bodies, as well as national reporting on national communications, NDCs and maps. I am going to run over time, but I need to get through this next piece, which is just a little bit about the Paris Committee on Capacity Building and the other constituted bodies. There's a request that all constituted bodies include in their regular reports progress made towards the integration of gender perspectives in their respective processes. This was a Marrakesh. When we extended the Lima Work Programme on gender, this was a request in that decision. There's been a technical paper and a dialogue with the chairs of constituted bodies to support that reporting requirement, And this one, Gender 101 webinar, is also intended to support the process of identifying where and how the Paris Committee on Capacity Building will be integrating gender and reporting on it. And we're offering tailored sessions for each of the constituted bodies as requested. So I'm going to leave it there, and then I'm going to ask a colleague, Verona Calantes-Lavalley, who's the Intergovernmental Specialist with UN Women, to move us on to the next section, which is looking at key gender concepts and terminologies under the UNFCCC and in related environmental contexts. And we're going to hear from other presenters. We'll present these concepts as a first initial step, and then we'll see how those concepts are then used in different contexts of case studies and action.
Okay, so while we're waiting for the presentation to get uploaded, let me just start. So the term gender is a concept that seeks to attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, and it also shapes and determines what is expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or a man in a given context. So this means that it's socially constructed, it's context and time specific, which means it's changeable, but while we know that it's changeable, it's difficult to make it happen because it's linked to values, social norms, stereotypes, and challenging or diverging can lead to opposition and social sanctions. Okay, so they managed to upload it. Thank you so much. In this initial presentation, you can just find some images doing a quick Google search on what women's roles or gender implies. And you can see these are stereotypes. So a boy, a strong boy, and a girl princess. Here, the mind of a boy, the brain is more oriented to tools. And here, with the girl, it's all related to beauty and some things related to that. So again, as I was mentioning, these are social constructs. Regarding social constructs, and also I mentioned that because of this, we associate certain roles, certain expectations, certain types of behavior to a man, a woman, a girl, a boy, and which leads to differences and inequalities as to roles, responsibilities, activities, contributions, including what you can wear. My daughter was looking for a sweater, and she liked blue sweaters, and you could only find it in the male or boy section, for example. So then it also leads to inequalities such as access to and control over resources. The rights has implications on rights, has implications on decision-making power, voice, and agency, which then links to other grounds of inequality. And this is why we talk about intersecting forms of discrimination. The next slide also shows images, again, of inequalities. So the top left speaks of the household activities performed by men as opposed to women, and you can see the difference in time. And we also know that household activities are most often unremunerated, undervalued, and not even counted as activities. And we can see in the lower portion, this is the wage gap. So we are in 2018, and still we see that there is that for every dollar that a man receives for the same amount of work, women receive 60% or 67%. So I have to move on. I was given warning. So just to review some of the usages, the terms related to or gender-specific terms that we hear. There's gender equality. This is the goal. And then we hear gender mainstreaming, which is a strategy to contribute to or achieve the goal of gender equality. Gender analysis, which is a tool or methodology to thresh out or identify gender equality issues. Then we hear about gender perspectives, which are factors that have to be taken into account when you're looking at interventions, actions, policies. Then there's gender-sensitive, gender-responsive, gender-blind. We've moved to gender-responsive, I think, and we'll look at that in the succeeding slides. And gender-neutral. But this term, gender-neutral, we now say that it has to always be challenged. I remember in one workshop where we're talking about soil, and the presenter said, when we asked about the gender implications, saying that soil has no gender, but we can find some interconnection. So here again, as I mentioned, gender equality is the goal, and just to make sure that equal rights, opportunities, and benefits accrue to both men and women, that women are empowered and have voice and decision-making opportunities. Again, the issue of gender equality, this has to be something that we have to keep in mind. The issue of gender equality should concern and fully engage men too. So it's not just an issue for women. I spoke about gender responsive. So by gender responsive, here we are it's a term to describe laws, policies, programs, interventions that are formulated, planned, and delivered to take into account existing structures and gender inequalities, and also to find measures and interventions to overcome and remove them. It also seeks to identify and bring attention to women's contributions and critical role as agents and leaders. So it's not just the aspect of them being vulnerable and the impact, but also how are we able to contribute to facilitate gender equality and advance women's empowerment and the enjoyment of their rights. I'll skip this. This is just the SDGs. SDG 5, Sustainable Development Goal, as you know, gender and Sustainable Development, SDG 5, and what are the linkages to the other SDGs. I'll leave that. And just about gender mainstreaming. So this just shows that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has really reinforced the mandate for gender equality. And we can also see in the Climate Change Goal 13, which speaks of gender responsive capacity building. Gender mainstreaming as a strategy. Here, gender equality becomes the center of attention. So this requires that there has to be some assessment and analysis of the implications of intervention on women and men in all relevant processes. all areas, all types of actions at all levels. I'm given another reminder, so let me move to gender analysis. So, as I said, gender analysis is a tool, and as a tool, what would be helpful is to ask questions, and I'll just move to here. I have a set of guiding questions which we have in one of our toolkits, and just to help us understand gender, the situation of gender inequalities. What is the context? Who has what? Who does what? And who decides? Who benefits? So those are the headline questions, but I provided some sub-questions underneath that. I don't have time to go over it, but again, in the slides, I'll have more details. We have to also look at the division of labor by sex when we're doing gender analysis, the use, access, control, and benefits from resources, the issue of environmental degradation and how climate change affects men and women differently, and also what activities need to be carried out to be able to respond to their needs and also their contributions. And finally, this is what I would like to present for my last slide. Gender mainstreaming requires, it's not a one-off, so it's a commitment and which requires consistency and consistent effort at all levels. So it's not just ensuring do no harm, but recognizing that women's rights and women's empowerment is an essential part of climate solution, climate action. That methodologies are necessary but not sufficient. It requires visible, consistent political will, and that mainstreaming both advances gender equality and the effective achievement of climate change goals. So I'll stop there. Sorry, that's my last slide. And there will be another presentation on which we can go on this in detail. Thanks.
So the next presentation is Amelia Reyes from Mexico. She's been a very great supporter of gender equality under our process, and I am really pleased that she's able to speak to us today about gender responsive budgeting for climate change, because it is a critical tool and it is something that she explains very well. So Amelia, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Fleur, and hello to everybody who's there. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you, but I'm really thrilled that I'm here to present this amazing tool. So if we go to the first slide, I can present what is the content of this presentation. So first we're going to tell the difference between what are the two main points of entry to gender responsive budgeting, or GRB. One is analysis and the other is the design of the programs. And then what is the definition? What are GRB? And I will talk more about the normative dimension of GRB. Mostly people think that the budgetary allocation has only an economic dimension, but I will show how there is a very important normative dimension that we need to bear in mind. And how does that apply to the legislative branch? Finally, in an example of Mexico, so that I can show you a case from real life. And then how is that related to climate change and gender responsive budgeting, and what are the crossings? So the other element I will show is, going back to the first slide, what is the design of GRB, and how is that would pertain mostly to the executive branch, and how is that related as well with the trend that we see now over the world about results-oriented processes. and what are the elements of success. So if we go to the following slide, we will see that gender budgeting started in Australia in 1995. You can move to the next slide. The first experience on gender-responsive budgeting happened in Australia and UK in 1995. Both of these experiences were analyzing what programs in the overall national budget were addressed to diminish gender inequalities. And this is really important, and they did that through the analyzing of what were the programs and what was the budgetary allocation, because they started to realize that gender-responsive budgeting could be a tool to showcase the real implications of the commitment of a policy to gender equality, meaning people say all the time, oh, gender equality is a priority for us, but then when we see how much budget is allocated to it, we see that it's very little. So this was a very important point in history. And then the first experience to design the gender-responsive budgeting from the point of view of the executive branch was started in Mexico in 2002. So if we go to the following slide, I will go into the definition. I think, to the definition. First of all, GRB is a fiscal tool, meaning it can relate to the top fiscal policies have two dimensions. One is revenue, another is expenditure. So this refers to the expenditure side. There is definitely a strong experience from the gender experts on taxation and gender, but gender-responsive budgeting will only refer to the side of the expenditure. So we have two dimensions, and this is what it gets more interesting because it involves the programming and the budgetary allocation. So mostly when people say gender budgeting, they think that it's only about money, but it's actually referred to the way in which we insert the gender perspective into the entire programming and budgetary allocation, so that is the program and the actions that are related to the way in which we want to reduce gender inequalities. So what we want to do with this is to modify negative impact of public policies due to existing gender inequalities. And I will see some examples later on. Can we move to the following slide? Thank you. So as I was saying, usually people think that the budgetary allocation has more of a monetary or economic dimension, but well, I want to highlight here that it also has a normative dimension inherent in itself, meaning that it mandates the way in which actions will be carried out during a period of time. For instance, if you have a yearly budgetary allocation, you know that there is only so much you can do. So there is an addressing, very intentional addressing in the way our actions will be shaped by the budgetary allocation. So that's like the inherent normative dimension. The second normative dimension is more technical because it involves either the faculties of whether it is applied to the legislative branch or the Ministries of Finance, in which, depending on the ruling on the budget, it is that we are able to do certain things and not others. So when we are thinking about budgetary allocation, this normative dimension is crucial to bear in mind, so that we are not only thinking that it is about allocating money, but more so about the dynamics of that budgetary allocation. So if we go to the following slide, I will go through an example on how to apply it to the legislative branch. As I was saying, in Australia and UK, it started with an analysis of the programs that had a budgetary allocation for gender equality. And we will see how it has developed. I will point out the example in Mexico, in which we have different referential tools for the annual national budget. This is now official. First of all, Mexico's national budget has a listing as an annex at the end of the national annual budget, has a listing of all the programs for gender equality, and includes all sectors, because all sectors at least are mandated to have one program related to gender equality. This is really interesting because it's a tool to dimension how far have we gone and how far we still to go. It's an accountable tool. or a transparency tool. And this is most of the experience on gender budgeting relates to this type of analysis. But we see now that however far we have tried to include gender equality into the programs of an administration, there is not one experience in the world that has gone beyond 1% of the programs in a national budget. So this is really striking because it shows that 99% of the rest of the programs are still lacking the gender perspective and therefore probably are reproducing inequalities. So this listing of which programs are addressing explicitly gender equality is crucial to have a starting point. The second referential tool that we have in Mexico is an article that is linked to the annex. This is also part of the normative dimension of gender budgeting, and it details the methodology for the programs that are to be included in the annex. So it's not just a listing, but it also shapes the way a program can be included in the annex, meaning it has to have certain segregation data, it has to have indicators to reduce gender gaps, and other elements. And this will be crucial because I will show you in another slide how it refers as well to incentives that institutions have to include these type of dimension in their programs. So we go to the next slide. I'm gonna move to the other referential tools, and then I'll move again back to this incentive. So the third referential tool that we have in the national budget in Mexico is the tracking by category. So we have a different annex that is listing what programs are aimed to eradicate discrimination against women, what programs aim to eradicate violence against women, and which programs aim to achieve gender equality. And this is interesting because then it shapes the different types of impact that we want to see. And finally, this is my favorite. We have an annex that tracks by institution how much is the expenditure that every institution is allocated to women and how much expenditure is allocated to men. And it refers to all institutions, so the environment, energy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, education and health. But this is really interesting because it is a commitment to say that all institutions need to start segregating their data, not only at the programmatic level, but also at the core of their budget. And what are the incentives to do this? Because it sounds like it's a lot of work. Well, the incentives are, first of all, the earmarking in the sense of non-transferability, meaning that if you have one allocation for a budget during the year, no one can remove that budget from use, and you cannot transfer it to another sector or to another action. But the most important one is the non-reducibility, meaning that once you have all these criteria fulfilled that relate to the article that I was mentioning in the previous slide, you have an incentive of non-reducibility, meaning that from one year to the other, once you have an allocation, they cannot diminish that amount the next year. So that gives a continuity and ensuring that the program is going to have a continuity. And that this is super important because I will refer now that during huge crises like 2 years ago, all the sectors in Mexico had a reduction of the budget up to half of the allocation from one year to the other, and the only programs that survived in the existing budgetary allocation were those that were part of gender equality annex, because there is all this legislation around the gender budgeting. So this is really crucial, and what it aims is precisely to go to progressivity, to keep on covering the rest of the 99% of the programs that are still missing. If we go to the next slide, you will see in Mexico we also have another annex because Mexico keeps track of 7 priorities through the national annual budget. Each of them has their own annex. So climate change and gender equality have 2 of them. Annex 16 is for climate change, and it both covers the programs that are addressing mitigation and adaptation. But the current status of this annex is the one that I mentioned. It's just a list for accounting the number of programs, but it doesn't have the other referential tools that I mentioned for under 13, gender equality. which is linked to all these other referential tools, as I mentioned, the article and the earmarking and stuff. So what we see is that the next step is to progressively mainstream gender equality into the program for climate change. If we go to the next slide with the crossing, there are some programs that are both in the climate change and the gender equality annexes, meaning that some programs for climate change, when they include gender equality, are benefited from the incentives on non-reducibility and non-transferability, and which are referring to agriculture, cattle raising, rural development, fisheries, some programs of the Ministry of Environment, also energy and electricity. But the thing is that they're included only at the policy level, but not at the program level. And that's why when the crisis 2 years ago happened in Mexico, these programs were able to save their entire budgetary allocation, but the Ministry of Environment suffered a loss of 50% of their budget from one year to the other. So this is why we're trying to especially work on the strategic programs related to mitigation and adaptation to see how progressively and fastly we can ensure that by integrating gender equality, we can also preserve those programs that are crucial to the saving of the environment. So can we move to the following slide? So the other dimension refers to the executive branch. I'm going to go just very generally under what is it take, because the programs then need to have a gender diagnostic, which is to explore what are the differentiated conditions of population and specific inequalities. And related to the issue of, for instance, what is the relation between water and gender inequalities or energy or oceans. So it is really important to have that awareness in the sectorial dimension. And then what we do is to check on every program. So my organization has an experience in training institutions, and we work with the Mexican government to review the program, to go through the actions of the program, and to reprioritize the actions now that they have inserted the gender perspective. And finally, of course, once you reallocate, you review the priorities, then you reallocate the budget. Because a budget is tied to the actions. This is why we cannot just say we need more money. It's how you improve the actions, and those actions are guaranteed to have a gender budgetary allocation. So finally, we work with relational indicators that are measuring how we are diminishing the inequality gap and what is happening in terms of process, results, and impacts. If we move to the following, yes, thank you, the following slide. You will see that the DRB is compatible with results-oriented budgets. We definitely want to see results in climate change more than ever. But then the mixture between this tool and the results-oriented budget enhances the efficiency of sectorial results, but also it adds a social dimension to those results. And what we always say is that it's not about asking for more spending, but better spending. We don't need to increase the budgetary allocation. We are just reviewing existing programs and improving and strengthening the actions that we have by adding the social components. Next slide. So what are the elements for success? We believe that there is the need to include several actors and make alliances, for instance, in the legislative branch, the Commission of Finance of Fiscal Responsibilities, in alliance with the Commission for Gender Equality and Women's Affairs. In the executive branch, the Ministries of Finance have a very good alliance with the mechanisms for the advance of women, or other institutions that are like the Ministry of Environment in the state. And it is really helpful to have formats or methodologies or reporting tools, such as the manual for planning. It has to explain how to make the connection between these two methodologies. And in Mexico, we have been very successful in doing that. But also, people think that we need to start from the first moment of the budgetary cycle, that this is a very flexible tool, so we can actually do it in all stages of the budgetary cycle. And I think the next one is my final slide. Yes, So the thing is that gender-responsive budgeting has a primacy in social sectors. People think that gender is only about social sectors, but there is actually a wide range of experiences in different cities in Mexico that are related to transportation, to urban pavement and urban furniture, to water and sanitation, to infrastructure, building two highways with a gender perspective, or waste management, and as already mentioned, energy and agriculture. So this is really a very useful tool to enhance both dimensions, and at the same time, it will help to achieve all the commitments that other countries have and that we need more than ever. So with that, I finish my first presentation, and thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And we're just going to we are running a little bit behind, but we are going to take a couple of questions that we've already received on the first presentations that we've heard. So there was a question around whether or not a lack of integration in technology mitigation and finance articles under the Paris Agreement will have an effect on prioritization at implementation, so the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I'm going to take a first shot at answering that and say that it is reflective of the previous decisions around technology mitigation and finance, but that the Paris Agreement is not the only tool we have under our process in order to integrate gender into these the processes of the Paris Agreement. So the work under the Gender Action Plan complements the work that's going on in relation to the implementation of the NDCs, and there are ways in which we can strengthen the implementation of NDCs through the priority areas of the action plan. But I'll leave it also open to any of the other panelists who might want to comment on that.
So yeah, just to check on what Fleur mentioned, that the lack of or the seeming lack of attention to the gender, the relationship or the linkage between gender equality in mitigation and technology. I think this goes back to if you remember in my earlier presentation when we said that gender neutral has to be challenged, because these are some of the areas where in the beginning, when we were making the linkages in gender issues in the climate change process, that the aspect of technology mitigation and finance, that gender doesn't matter. But what we know now is if you look at the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, these are climate finance mechanisms, and you would see that the emphasis there is now to really integrate gender perspectives, including by having a gender action plan in programs, both mitigation and adaptation submitted GCF and GF funding. So, and related to that, we, with the UNFCCC Secretariat, had an expert group meeting back in 2015, I believe, where we actually had very, very concrete recommendations on how to integrate gender in technology needs assessment. So it's really a matter of finding a specific intervention, specific action, so that then you can make the linkage to gender equality and gender perspective linkage more targeted.
Thank you. And there was another question, another comment on the fact that these gender terms are generic and wanting more specific ones in the UNFCCC environmental context. The reality is that there are not, so gender responsiveness is not defined within the context of the UNFCCC, and we rely on the UN definitions as they are determined through other processes. And so, for instance, gender equality as it is under ECOSOC. But gender responsiveness is also, we're seeing over time how that is evolving and being interpreted. But there is a common understanding of what gender responsiveness means in the environmental context. And I think that's already been outlined by Verona. But in a sense, it is the same whether it is the environmental context or the health context or whether you're looking at agriculture or energy. The purpose of that is always about ensuring that all people are being included and that the gender analysis is being undertaken in a way that identifies and answers those questions that Verona had mentioned. But we can take that up a bit later, because now I'm going to hand over. Thank you. And I just addressing a comment that the Technology Executive Committee and the CTCN advisory and the CTCN are, in fact, and through the technology community, are addressing gender issues both within the tech and within the CTCN, and certainly that has been something that has been evolving also along with the gender work under the UNFCCC. We've certainly seen an increase in the amount of work that's going on both through the CTCN and the tech. So I will now stop there in answering questions, and we'll have a moment for questions again after the next couple of presentations. And so what we thought we also wanted to do was move from concepts and the sort of general terms to look at this in a practical way. And we have now heard the example of Mexico and the gender budgeting in that context. And I'm delighted that we have Shailesh here, Senior Program Coordinator, Gender and Climate Change at ICCC, International Center for Climate Change and Development. Thank you, Shailesh. And I will hand over to you to take it from here.
Thank you, Fleur, and the host organization for inviting me from Bangladesh to present the case study on integrating gender considerations in climate policy and action. And today I'm going to present a case study from Bangladesh about the climate change adaptation and the capacity building support, how we are implementing this in the context of a very vulnerable country like Bangladesh. So before going deeper into the presentation, I'd just like to highlight the country profile of Bangladesh. And most of the time, Bangladesh is often cited as a very hard-hit and most vulnerable country globally in terms of climate change impact. So you can see that Bangladesh, in terms of global climate risk index in 2017, it ranked 6th rank. And it is one of the highest densely populated country in the world with high level of poverty. And for climate change, we regularly have GDP loss each year, 0.732. And there are a number of very climate-induced hazards that the country regularly faces, like drought, flash floods, salinity, and cyclone, and other kind of climate change hazards. But although Bangladesh is cited as the most vulnerable country globally, but in certain areas, Bangladesh has already championed in terms of climate adaptation because of the involvement of the local people, but also the support from the government. But we all know that we have a long way to go. So we already had a discussion from Verona and Emilia about women's role, the gender aspects of climate change, and number of definitions, but I like to highlight in terms of the developing country and vulnerable country, what are the social roles of women and how women are being affected due to climate change. So women are more severely affected by natural disasters due to different factors like social roles, structural barriers at institutional level, their less access to resources, different level of discrimination and poverty. And women are usually, for those reasons, underrepresented in decisions about disaster preparedness, climate change adaptation, and mitigation activities. Also, Verona explained, but I'll also highlight some of the issues women's access to the technology areas, and then choices of basic amenities like employment, technology, and finance. So I just like to give an idea about the scenario from Bangladesh, that in 1991, the cyclone and flood in Bangladesh, there was more than 90% victim sites were women. And we had around 1 million of people who were directly affected in 1991. And we regularly face this kind of super cyclone in Bangladesh. But due to different level of adaptation initiatives and capacity building support, so in 2007 the situation has improved a little bit. So we also find there that in the super cyclone Sido, the ratio of male and female death was 1:5. So I think this clearly draws the conclusion that how women are being affected due to different negative effects of climate change and disaster. So I'm going to present a case study from Bangladesh. It's about the Shore Development and Settlement Project. It's mainly developing new aggregate land in Bangladesh and started in 2011, and it is co-financed by Bangladesh government with Netherlands Embassy and IFA. And from our side, we provided gender mainstreaming support to that specific project. So we provided support for developing their gender action plan and also capacity building support to different tiers of project implementers. And the project supported an estimated population of 55,000 persons in 28,000 of households. And the key components were protection for climate change, climate resilient infrastructure, land settlement and cycling, and livelihood support. So, since the last 4 years, we have provided this gender mainstream support to that specific project through an empowerment approach. When we talk about empowerment approach or gender mainstreaming, we are actually trying to focus on the 4 key interactive elements of empowerment, like social, physical, political, and economic empowerment. So we worked in that location, and later on, actually, we conducted a study, here this study is an outcome of 30 cases on random basis. We looked into both the intervent areas and also the non-intervent areas and tried to have a comparison in between these 2 areas. And the main study questions we focused on that what was the situation of the respondents before the project intervention, and what is the current situation of the respondents due to this kind of positive support in terms of capacity building, and what are the opportunities and limitations of the respondents' faces in terms of climate change and challenges, and how does they perceive their future. And focusing on the gender aspects of climate resilience, so key intervention areas and capacity building support, there were mainly protection from climate change, that includes the adapt to the climate change by ensuring effective management of water resources, ecosystem management, protection against tidal and storm surges, and improving drainage capacity, and also how to provide climate resilient internal infrastructure such as cyclone shelters, roads, bridges, and deep tubers for water supply. So here also the technology areas come, especially in terms of cyclone shelter and other areas, whether those are woman-friendly or gender-friendly. And then there were social and livelihood support that included capacity building, skill development training, group formation for management of natural resources, preparedness for disaster and early warning mechanism, homestead agriculture and value chain development, poultry and livestock and fisheries program. And it also included legal support, because that is very important to know about what kind of legal and human rights-based support available for the woman, because most of the time they are not aware of their rights. So what was the situation before the intervention? So there was lack of law and order and insecurity also in that specific area. There was no land ownership for women. That is a huge problem in Bangladesh. Okay, I'll try to go a little early. And there was also what the situation, how the situation has been improved. So there has been the land titling, especially jointly by name of the wife for the woman and also the husband, and there were road networks and all other facilities that those have been placed. And the transformational change that we achieved through this empowerment approach, that women achieved positive images in the family and also in their community. They have access to social networks. They also became member of different study groups, and they have, there was created a market access for the women. And they also have better control over their own earnings. In terms of physical, actually, they have more access to the water and sanitation facilities, especially safe water facilities that have direct linkages with the SRHR rights of the women. And also in terms of political support, women hold different positions in different boards and local government structure after the intervention of the project. And the basic thing, the transformational evidence of climate resilience and empowerment of women, the project achieved that 10,000 families had land titles to the male and given to the woman by part. And land titles are registered in the names of wife, and the wife's name actually comes first. This is something remarkable in the context of Bangladesh, where less than 1% women have land ownership. And if the woman is widowed, divorced, or abandoned, in that case, the land is entirely going to be in her ownership. Especially the land titles are strengthening her family and giving them the legal role and entitlements in many decisions. That is also supporting them for building resilience. And the rest of child marriage also drops, and the average distance of safe water sources also decrease. So this is a key outcome, but I like to highlight some of the key areas that is really very important, the way out with the gender responsive climate change adaptation. So the capacity building areas, it is required capacity building at all levels, understanding the gender roles properly, because most of the time we have a misconception about the gender. It is about the power relations, and it is not always synonymous to women. It is there are other people. When we talk about gender, it is gender plus, there are disabled people, there are ethnic minorities, there are adults and girls. So we need to look at their specific needs in terms of climate change. And also how we can reach the hard to reach areas. And capacity building also very important for the institution holder and government mechanism. We also need to have gender responsive or gender sensitive indicators, both quantitative targets and qualitative interpretation, because that is very important. Because without qualitative interpretation, we cannot measure or see the progress, how the qualitative changes are being happened. We also need to talk about the climate governance, because it is very important to create an ownership, transparency, and accountability of local government and local water or ecosystem management. Gender responsive technology, because we have evidence, and we very often actually women become the victims of all this technology gaps. For example, in terms of water points, designs of toilets, access to new technology and innovation, especially in agriculture and rainwater harvesting quality, and also very importantly, the early warning mechanisms are not always gender friendly, so they cannot receive the information into the situation of emergency preparedness. And then there is gender budgeting that Emily already responded, but it is also very important that we also need to have a gender responsive analysis of budget priorities, allocation, and to see the distribution pattern at the different government levels. And the challenges that we mentioned and the areas we really need to address. But even before that, when we, at the end of our evaluation, we spoke with the women, and then there were questions that what will happen with us when the project is over. So here comes the starting, that how we are going to sustain our capacity building support and continue our efforts together for strengthening this gender mainstream support to the climate change projects, and how we can improve this in policy and also into action. Because when we see the exit strategy everywhere, actually women are also not sure, and the government and the institutions, they are not so much sure about how this development gain and benefit is going to be sustained for the women. and how we can address the societal and structural barriers at the very field level. So I think this kind of support we need to continue, and here I'm ending my presentation, but you are most welcome to have any kind of questions.
Thank you very much. And we are now coming to the last presentation, which will also be Verona, and I'm going to have to ask Verona to quick with this one so that we have an opportunity to have to answer the questions that are coming in.
Thank you, Fleur, and welcome again. So I'll try my best to be as quick as possible. Is this one? No. Okay. So just a number of capacity building activities that we've done so far in the context of the UNFCCC. As I mentioned, there was an expert group meeting on gender-responsive technology needs assessment and finance, and the output of that is a report with very concrete recommendations designed to address the specific stakeholders. Then in 2016, we had a learning and dialogue with the UNFCCC Secretariat Technical Team, where we gathered very useful insights on entry points, better understanding of what's discussed in the different work areas of the UNFCCC, as well as entry points to incorporating gender. And then what I'm going to discuss here in this presentation is the toolkit that we prepared for the Green Climate Fund on mainstreaming gender in the project submitted to the Green Climate Fund. So, as we know, the Green Climate Fund is the first climate fund to integrate gender considerations from the outset. So there was already an entry point there. The toolkit that we produced with the GCF Secretariat is basically a very practical tool or a manual that walks one through all the stages of project design, planning, through implementation and monitoring. And in this slide you can see what's in the tool. So it starts from mainstreaming gender and readiness support, and then throughout the project cycle, there's the section on gender analysis, gender assessment, gender responsive results framework, project implementation and monitoring and evaluation, project appraisal, example of a gender assessment and action plan, and examples of gender responsive indicators. It's a 78-page document, but it's really very useful because it's in chunks. So if you just want a gender analysis, it gives you specific steps to do that, and so on. So this, I'm not sure if this is it's not maybe very clear, but this is the gender mainstreaming in the entire project cycle as presented in that tool. So from reviewing the national policies through the national climate change plans and strategies, from the project identification and concept development of concept notes to doing the gender analysis, gender assessment, the results framework, and then project implementation. So just taking you through that. In the slide, what I did was to link you to the tools. So I think I'm not going to go through the details, but if you look at the tools section, that's where the toolkit gives specific activities. Let's say, for example, mainstreaming gender in the readiness support, and so on. So as you know, the different stages of project proposal development. So again, this is the gender analysis I presented earlier, there are guiding questions for gender analysis, and there was a question earlier about how to be specific. This tool gives you the specific linkage to climate change. So the questions are addressed to link it to your climate change program. So, and then gender assessment. What do you do to do gender assessment? So there's a section on gender narrative and the problem tree analysis. And the tool walks you through all of this. For the problem tree analysis, for example, you identify the problem, what is the obvious and less visible causes of the problem, what's the effect, and how are we able to link the cause and the effect. I'm sorry that we have to go through it quickly, but I hope that you will look into the tool itself and see what I'm talking about, because it's really, really very instructive. And I think that it has helped a lot. So there's a section also for the GCF to come up with a gender action plan. So the tool also gives an example of what a gender action plan could look like. And then the gender responsive results framework, again, it gives examples of how that would look like, including having indicators and the 3 levels of results: performance framework, the fund level, the project program level, and the program level outcomes and outputs. Also, in terms of implementation and monitoring, there are specific guidelines in the tool for gender responsive implementation. First of all, the need for establishing baselines, allocation of resources, gender responsive approaches to make sure that women are not negatively affected by the project, but actually benefit equally from the project, that women are engaged in the whole process and are active contributors. And then you have the monitoring and evaluation part of it there too. So this is the summary of what we have in the tool. I think I can stop there and can entertain questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is one of a number of tools that are actually available. So the tool in relation to the GCF is a specific tool for the GCF. But there are also tools that have been prepared by other organizations that can support the process, including a gender responsive national communications toolkit. And all of these tools are designed to help bring the concepts of gender into the very specific processes under our process, which can be helpful because even though gender analysis is the methodology for gender analysis is effectively the same whether you're doing it for health or doing it for climate change, it can be helpful to see it in the context of each of the processes and where the entry points are. And so we come to the point where if you have, we're going to have a look at the questions that have already come in, but if you have any questions, please send them through. We have a question around the indicators, I think, for Sheila's presentation, and whether or not there were, what the indicators were and what the methods were, and the point that there needing to be qualitative and quantitative indicators was identified as something that was a strength. So if you wanted to just answer that question about indicators for that particular project.
Thank you. Now for the indicators, asking for that question. So the methodology that we applied for that specific project, it was mainly qualitative methodology to collect the information and outcome, especially the inquiry methodology, but we also have time-to-time follow-up and focus group discussions. And we go through with the project beneficiaries and the respondents around 1 year of time. So we also had them interviewed at the very beginning of the project at the inception level, and we had time-to-time follow-up with them after 1 year and then again after 1 year, and also again after the end of the project. But the indicators we applied, because we were not the direct implementer, mainly the implementer with the government and the Netherlands Embassy and the government agencies, we provided the gender mainstreaming support. So we supported them to develop their gender action plan, and also we supported them to identify gender responsive indicators, mainly the quantitative ones, because there were not that much understanding about the qualitative indicators, but we also tried to have different level of case study collections and interview with them. So the quantitative indicators are mainly about that in terms of having the gender and sex desegregated data based on age and based on the disability and based on different level of vulnerable groups. And for the qualitative indicators, also we try to have different levels of tools and methodologies. For example, in terms of participation in the group work or in the committee, we try to look at the active participation of the women, and we very often used to look at the register book and how they are participating, and sometimes also to have follow-up with the process documentation. So this really helps us to see how the activation level and strengthening of women empowerment happening for that specific project. And in terms of quantitative indicators also, we try to see women's increased participation in different tiers, for example, in the local government level, but also in the water management group, and also there are climate change and disaster management group at the very ground level of Bangladesh. So number of women's participation, what was before that and after that, and especially women holding the executive body membership in the group. For example, if women are having the position of being selected as the treasurer or the chairman of that specific local group of disaster and climate change management at the very ground level. So by these, we try to have both the combination of quantitative and qualitative indicators, and how collectively we strengthen the interventions at the local level.
Thank you very much, Shana, for that explanation. And there was also a further question around comment about the interesting results post-intervention, and could you give examples of some of the specific activities that were undertaken in Bangladesh to achieve these? So I'm not sure if you understand what the point of that one was, the post-intervention.
Yeah. Post-intervention, for example, the key achievement from the project I mentioned about that achieving the land ownership, especially in the name of the woman, and their name comes first in terms of joint ownership of the land and household, because as I mentioned, that if the wife is become widowed or separated from the husband, the land ownership is going to entirely going to the woman. And that best practices also we try to implement and work with other government agencies so that this can be replicated in other areas to have land ownership and land distribution and land allocation for different of barren land existing in Bangladesh, or land allocation or distribution pattern. That is really the government also supporting how they can replicate this result to other coastal belts and other areas. So that is one of the things, post-intervention areas. And also in terms of women involving with the different labor constructing groups and management committees. So there also they used to allocate a number of amount of money, and later they used to build up different level of cooperatives with the support of the government, how they can become empowerment to have access to the market and to become small entrepreneur with their products. So this post-intervention initiative also becoming sustained in some of the particular areas of the local area. And I think we can also have a follow-up of those activities, how we can strengthen the initiative later on.
Thank you. And then another question, and thank you, Tracy, for all your questions, around whether or not there are penalties or incentives for GCF proposals that lack gender integration. And I'll start and let some of the others to comment. That there is a fairly significant incentive in that there is funding available through the readiness program for meeting the requirements of the gender action plan and the gender policy under the GCF. And it is a requirement. So that I think it's probably, it's not that it's a penalty, it's that it is a requirement.
Yeah, so this is the slide that I rushed through, but here, these are what Fleur was mentioning, it's a requirement. So these are really part of the checklist. So have you done a gender analysis? Have you done a gender assessment? And there are sections, in fact, in the template, in the project proposal template, where you have to fill up these parts. You see, you can see sections, parts, environment, social assessment, including gender considerations. Paradigm shift potential includes a subsection on the potential role for women can play in the project as agents of change. The needs part, identify vulnerabilities, and then now this is more recent, the gender action plan. You have to have a separate gender action plan. And then the results framework that I talked about earlier, there is also the specific gender responsive results framework, gender sensitive indicators and targets at the output level, and then the environment and social safeguards report. So I think it's part of the checklist, whether or not you get more points because you do it well, because they're not all the same. You know, some are just really like putting women, the term women or risk of gender here and there, but really not substantive. But at least there are requirements, and they're very, very specific requirements.
Yes, to add one thing. Just very interestingly, recently from Bangladesh, we had an analysis on the gender context of GCF project proposal approval. And we also found that since its inception from 2015, that 84% of all proposals that approved by the GCF have included a strong gender assessment into their project, and with 67% containing a project level gender and social inclusion plan. So I think a strong inclusion of gender components that really actually supports the GCF project, especially the project development phase, to have better success.
Thank you. And I think because there is the point, of course, about the quality of that integration, but by having it there from the inception, what that allows for is obviously a monitoring of that over time, and that will then lead to further learning and potentially strengthening or support in different areas. And this is certainly what's happened under the GEF through their review of how gender was included in GEF 6. That has led to a change and an update to the way in which gender is integrated in GEF 7. So it is a process, and I think what this shows, though, is also a willingness to have this evolve over time and to strengthen it over time. And I'm just checking to see if there are any other questions. There was a question that was asked earlier that we weren't really sure what it was around. A question around global versus national, but we're not entirely sure what the question related to.
I think that must be the one on one of my slides. If I'm where it says second shift, which is that the second shift?
Right.
That's I checked, and that's U.S. data. So it just gives examples from an article on the share of time that men and women use for household activities. Yeah, it's a U.S. data, and it's also to point out what is lost by not considering women's time. And it's a McKinsey report in 2015. I think you've heard about this, that we're losing 26 trillion or 28 trillion or 26% of global GDP by not counting women's unpaid work globally.
And I think we've come to the end of all of our questions. Yep, I think we've done that. So, and we are 3 minutes before finish. So I'd like to just check if Jennifer's still online. If she would like to say any words in closing, and otherwise I will sum up.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you for all the amazing presenters. This is for me, particularly has been a great session, really full of knowledge. There's a lot that has been done in gender and climate change, but there's still a lot to be done, as we can see, and then there's a lot of good practices and good methodologies that we can learn from them and maybe possibly enhance more of that great action that's being done out there. And of course, there's a lot of room for capacity building in this regard, as we can see on all the presenters, especially with the budgeting and the dimensions, and particularly, I didn't know there was a lot of this terminology for gender. I thought it was only climate change, but especially if you put those together, there's a huge pool of terminology there. So I'm not going to take a lot of time. I just want to thank all of you for attending this Gender 101 webinar on climate change and capacity building and gender as well. And back to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you all for joining. And thank you very much to our presenters who have had we have them in the room today despite travel issues. We will obviously be working with the CCPB further on capacity building in the context of gender, and we'll provide you with more information on that in the coming weeks. But we hope that this has been a useful starting point for thinking about how gender can not only how we can strengthen the gender considerations in climate policy, but also how in doing so, we can make climate policy more effective, more just, and we can use this as an opportunity not only to improve people's lives, but also to accelerate climate action. So I will leave it there, and we will thank you very much to you all, and we will be in touch with how you can access the presentations that we've shown today, and we have also recorded this, so if there are members who were unable to attend, we will also make that recording available. Thank you very much, and goodbye.